tribe of villagers are under threat from an evil force from the swamps of Kuzatan.
Black bottom girls who make the rockin' world go round.
I ummed and ahed about whether I was going to cover this at all. I even had a conversation with my partner about it, whether I should do it or not. And she came down more against, so I think I'm moderating what I would have said. So GenCon just happened, and James Raji of Lamentations, the Flame Princess, was there with his usual provocative bundle. But what seemed to set people off at him, doubtless more GenCon controversies will emerge over time, but was the cover of the catalogue for the Lamentations products, which he put out. I'm a sucker for a pun, and I'm a sucker for social commentary, and I am drawn to controversial topics. So when he put a bunch of impaled kids, implied to be the Stranger Things kids on Pikes on the cover of his catalogue, I just thought it was kind of funny, and that was that as far as I was concerned. Got a brief snort because of the pun, and on I went about my merry day. However, it's current year, and so if you do something like putting impaled kids on the cover of your catalogue for your series of horror dungeon games, apparently that's bad. Now, I don't want to get too much into it because I don't want to reward people for making a fuss about this. So I want to move back slightly and take a kind of more detached, wider, broader view, like I usually do on this channel, using current events as a prompt to talk about bigger issues, bigger things that are going on. But I will briefly say this. I don't see a problem with the image. It made me laugh, it made me chuckle. My only reservation would be that I don't think a catalogue, something you were handing out to people to try and get them to buy your other products, I don't think as a handout that was probably a good idea. Because someone who comes to your booth, sees what you're selling, whatever, that's one thing. Handing it out, it's going to be lying around all over the place, and people who don't know what you're about, who don't perhaps want to see it, might end up seeing it, and that's where you get people reacting in such a way. It's not helpful. It's probably not the best choice. Should we put it that way? Now, even before the whole atmosphere around gaming was as febrile and nasty as it is, I was selling Hentacle at conventions, and being a responsible chap and knowing that it was sexual content, even though they didn't have strict rules about that sort of thing at conventions, I kind of made a joke of it and sold it in brown paper envelopes. You used to get your porn back before the internet in brown paper bags and so on. Under plain cover, I think, is the euphemism that people use. So I made sensible compromise provisions, and I made a joke and a selling point out of the fact that the game was sold under plain cover. Right? I think that was the responsible thing to do in that instance. When you got it on a catalogue cover, a handout that's going out to people, probably not a good idea. What this really brings home to me, and what I really want to talk about though, is how the nature of conventions has changed, how commercial interests are shifting things, how role-playing, which is a niche of a niche really, if you look at tabletop games as a whole, is maybe suffering a bit because of this. And yeah, conventions just throw up a whole set of issues like this. And I guess the big problems you can point to, you can look at in this kind of milieu of problems, are the reactions to Lamentations, the way in which the Honey Badger Brigade was treated some years ago at Calgary Comics Expo, and how Kevin Rolfe was treated for running his game at the UK Games Expo. So what's changed, what's happened, what's different? There's a bunch of different factors. There's the performative wokeness thing going on. You know, if you see something problematic, you can't just go and move on. You have to point it out, you have to create a fuss, you have to create a stink, you have to get on social media and get your 15 minutes of fame for making someone else's life a misery. So you have to consider that. I wouldn't want that to silence or upset anyone, but I think you have to go in eyes wide open, knowing what you're in for. This statement will make you laugh, probably, but I'm not an intentional provocateur. I'm just someone who is interested in controversial topics and issues, and who is very staunchly in favour of free speech. James Raggi is a provocateur. He deliberately sets out to get reactions and often succeeds in provoking them, though even he seems to have been surprised by this one. That's fine, but I think you need to fine-tune it and still consider. Conventions used to be an opportunity for people who were otherwise quite isolated to come together, meet like-minded people. The convention structure in the 80s through the 90s into the early 2000s was a lot more forgiving, right? Because of that commonality, the sheer rush of meeting people who were like you and geeked out over the same things, and so on. You know, that was the big draw. Conventions like GenCon, like UK Games Expo, are now much more about board games, which have become much more commercial, much more popular, and there has been this real push in a way that we haven't seen probably since the first D&D controversies in the 80s, to make these conventions in particular family friendly and open up to normies, shall we say. And when that becomes a concern, a commercial concern, then you start seeing crackdowns from that side of things on the more edgy, interesting, niche, independent products, because they're often not particularly politic. Of course, we tend to see this as being rather one-sided. It's something like Lamentations that's going to get in trouble rather than something like Poisoned or Bliss Stage, right? There's a socio-political kind of aspect to that, in that you can get away with things if you're subjectively tagged woke, that you can't get away with if you're just edgy or genuinely independent or so on. So there's that aspect as well. So we have to consider commerciality, politics, family friendly, all of these kind of things. And it isn't, a convention isn't a thing where you go to get together with like-minded nerds who are forgiving and understanding of each other anymore. It is much more of a commercial thing. And role-playing games are increasingly being marginalised, tucked off to the sides. The open gaming tables are off campus or away, out of sight, out of mind. You know, that sort of thing. That's a problem. The times they are changing, and not necessarily for the better. Not all change is good. Something isn't necessarily better because it's new, and it isn't necessarily better because it's old. I think Raggi ran into trouble because children, just a trigger for some people, and because he hit this kind of weird nexus. I mean, the old school Renaissance, the old school revival, whatever you want to call it, it's fueled very much by nostalgia for the D&D of the old days, and a lot of these shows, like Stranger Things, that has really fueled this kids on bikes genre thing, are also based on kind of heady nostalgia, but of a different kind. Raggi longs for the days when D&D was considered edgy and black metal, you know, and it was played by the weirdos, freaks, and nerds, and somehow at the same time also scared people. Whereas the people who are into the whole kids on bikes thing, they look back at Goonies, Monster Squad. There weren't actually that many movies that fit the bill. And they have this kind of warm, cozy view of that time, and perhaps of D&D. And that's more what we see reflected in Stranger Things, that 80s that never was. And so there's a conflict between fluffy nostalgia and edgy nostalgia that doesn't really serve anybody. Conventions have changed. There's all these policies and things, and I've been warning for a long time that all it's ever going to take is one arsehole insisting that the anti-harassment and other rules be enforced stringently, and the convention staff are probably going to have no choice. So I would be a lot more careful if you're tempted to do something like what Raji has done. If I ever get back to another convention, I will certainly be even more careful and cautious than I was in the past. And I think we need to understand that the nature of conventions has changed, the nature of the hobby has changed, and not necessarily for the better. The best way to deal with this is probably to set up independent, role-playing focused conventions that are more like the old school conventions that were. Old school conventions for old school gamers. Zang.
Disappointment.
Can we please play D&D now?
No!